The police tape came down at exactly 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. 72 hours. That's all they gave her. That's all they gave Emma Hartley, age 9, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a purple jacket with a daisy patch her grandmother had sewn on herself. 72 hours before the search teams packed up their equipment, before the news vans pulled away from the quiet suburban street in Henderson County, before the case file got buried under a stack of others just like it. Statistical probability, they called it. After 72 hours, the chances dropped to almost nothing. That's what Sheriff Marcus Donnelly told Emma's mother, Jennifer. His hand on her shoulder like that would somehow make the truth hurt less. "We've done everything we can, ma'am. We'll keep the case open, of course, but we have to allocate resources where they'll make a difference." Jennifer Hartley didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She just stood there on her front lawn, watching the last patrol car disappear around the corner, and she felt something inside her go silent. The kind of silent that comes right before a building falls. The neighbors had stopped bringing casseroles 2 days ago. The volunteer search parties had dwindled from 200 people to 12, and now even the professionals were walking away. Emma's face still smiled from posters stapled to telephone poles, but already the rain had started to blur the ink. Already people were starting to look away. But 6 miles, outside of town, in a rusted single-wide trailer at the edge of the Whitmore National Forest, someone was just waking up. Not from sleep. Thomas Eugene Wade hadn't really slept in 3 years. Not since Kandahar. Not since the day his convoy hit that IED and he watched his best friend's body scattered across sand so white it looked like snow. No, Thomas Wade didn't sleep anymore. He just closed his eyes sometimes and waited for morning. He was 43 years old and looked 60. His hands shook unless he kept them busy. His chest carried shrapnel the VA hospital said was too close to his heart to remove. Some nights he could still hear the screaming. The only thing that kept him tethered to this world was the dog. Not his dog, technically. The dog had just shown up one morning about a year ago, skinny and scarred, limping on 3 legs because the 4th one ended in a twisted mess of bone and fur. Thomas had tried to shoo him away at first. He couldn't take care of himself, let alone some busted-up German Shepherd mix that looked like it had been through its own personal war. But the dog wouldn't leave. Just sat there on the cinderblock steps, patient as death. Those dark eyes watching him like it knew something Thomas didn't. So he'd given it water. Then food. Then a name. Sergeant. Because that's what the dog reminded him of. His old Sergeant Ramirez, who never left anyone behind. Thomas was pouring coffee from a dented percolator when Sergeant started barking. Not the normal bark, the urgent one. The one that raised the hackles on Thomas's neck because it reminded him of the sound dogs made in the villages when they smelled explosives. He stepped outside onto the porch and saw Sergeant standing rigid, staring into the tree line. The morning mist was still thick between the pines, and for a moment Thomas saw shapes in it. Ghosts. But then Sergeant took off, that 3-legged gait somehow fast, and Thomas found himself following before he even decided to, before he remembered all the reasons he didn't go into those woods anymore. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when Thomas saw it, a piece of purple fabric caught on a blackberry bush. Just a scrap, no bigger than his palm, but bright against all that green and brown. He pulled it free and felt the material between his fingers. Fresh, not weathered. He looked at Sergeant, who was already moving deeper into the forest, nose to the ground. And Thomas Wade, who hadn't felt anything like hope in 3 years, felt something flicker in his chest. Something small. Something dangerous. He didn't know about Emma Hartley yet. Didn't know the police had given up. Didn't know that in his shaking hands he held the first real clue in 72 hours. All he knew was that Sergeant had found something, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something. He pulled his old field jacket tighter against the morning cold and followed the dog deeper into the trees. Behind them, the trailer disappeared into the mist. Ahead, the forest waited with its secrets, And somewhere in that vast green silence, a clock was still ticking. Thomas Wade hadn't walked this deep into the Whitmore forest since the first week he'd moved to the trailer. Back then, in some fit of optimistic delusion, he'd thought maybe nature would heal him. Maybe trees and silence would do what the VA counselors and the pills and the group therapy sessions couldn't. He'd lasted 40 minutes before the panic attack hit. The way the branches hung down reminded him too much of electrical wires in bombed-out buildings. The way the wind moved through leaves sounded like whispers in Pashto. He'd stumbled back to the trailer, chest heaving, and hadn't gone past the tree line since. But now he was moving between the pines like his body remembered how to do this, even if his mind was screaming at him to turn back. Sargent was 15 feet ahead, moving with purpose, pausing occasionally to ensure Thomas was still following. The dog had always been smart. Smarter than Thomas, probably. Definitely more stable. Thomas's left hand was shaking badly now, so he shoved it into his jacket pocket where he couldn't see it. His right hand held the purple fabric. He'd looked at it more carefully once they'd stopped. There was a patch sewn onto it. A daisy. Hand-stitched, the kind of work someone's grandmother would do. The kind of detail that meant something. He tried to remember if he'd seen any news about a missing kid. He didn't watch TV anymore. The noise made his head hurt. But sometimes he'd catch glimpses when he went into town for supplies. Had there been something? Amber alerts that he'd walked past without reading. He felt a surge of guilt that surprised him with its intensity. When had he stopped caring about the outside world? When had he become the kind of man who could miss a missing child? The forest floor was getting rougher, sloping upward. They were heading toward the old logging roads that crisscrossed these mountains, abandoned since the lumber company went bust in the 90s. Thomas had studied maps of this area when he first moved here. Not for any good reason, just something to do. Something to focus on besides the noise in his head. Those maps were probably still in a drawer somewhere, covered in coffee rings and cigarette burns. He tried to visualize the terrain. If someone had taken a kid, where would they go? The old logging roads led to forgotten clearings, places where cabins had rotted into the earth, places where you could hide anything. Sargent stopped suddenly so abruptly that Thomas almost tripped over him. The dog's ears were flat against his skull, and he was growling low in his throat. Not the aggressive growl, the afraid one. Thomas felt his combat instincts kick in before he could stop them. He dropped into a crouch, scanning the trees, his hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Hadn't been there for 3 years. His heart was hammering now, that old familiar rhythm that meant danger close. He forced himself to breathe. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The way the counselor had taught him. The way he'd taught himself when the counselors gave up too. Then he saw what Sargent had seen. About 30 yards ahead, partially hidden by a stand of young birches, was a structure. Not a cabin exactly. More like someone had cobbled together scrap lumber and tarps into something that approximated shelter. Camouflage netting, draped over the top, the kind hunters used. Or the kind someone would use if they didn't want to be seen from above, from helicopters, from search planes. Thomas felt his blood go cold. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Professional almost. He should turn back, he knew that. The smart thing, the sane thing, would be to mark this location and get back to the trailer and call the police. Let them handle it. Let someone with a badge and a gun and backup deal with whatever was in that makeshift shelter. But Thomas Wade had stopped doing the smart thing the day he signed up for his 3rd tour. And something about that purple fabric in his pocket, something about the way Sargent was looking at him with those dark eyes, kept him moving forward. He approached the structure the way he'd approached 1,000 doorways in Afghanistan. From the side, low, watching for tripwires or pressure plates. His body remembered the muscle memory, even if his mind was chaos. When he got close, enough to see inside through a gap in the tarp, he stopped breathing. There was a sleeping bag on the ground, empty, a battery-powered lantern, bottles of water, and on a piece of plywood being used as a makeshift table, there was a purple jacket. The same purple as the fabric in his pocket. The same daisy patch. But no girl. The shelter was empty. Whoever had been here was gone, and they'd taken Emma Hartley with them. Thomas backed away carefully, then turned and ran. Well, moved as fast as his body would allow, which wasn't much like running anymore. His chest burned where the shrapnel pressed against things it shouldn't press against. Sargent kept pace with him, that three-legged gait somehow still fluid. They needed to get back. They needed to call this in. The police had given up, but Thomas Wade hadn't started yet. And somewhere deep in his broken mind, in the place where Sergeant Ramirez still lived and shouted orders, he heard a voice. Clear as the morning. Clear as gunfire. No one gets left behind, Wade. No one. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly was eating a turkey sandwich at his desk when his phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer. It had been a hell of a week. The Hartley case had drained every resource they had, and now the county commissioner was breathing down his neck about overtime costs. 72 hours of searching had turned up nothing. No witnesses, no evidence, no leads. Just a 9-year-old girl who'd vanished from her driveway like smoke. He'd done everything by the book, everything the FBI training had taught him. And the book said after 72 hours with no developments, you scale back. You can't save everyone. That's what his captain in Baltimore had told him years ago. You do what you can with what you have. But he answered the phone. Force of habit. Sheriff Donnelly speaking. The voice on the other end was rough, hesitant, like it hadn't been used for conversation in a long time. This is Thomas, Wade. I live out on Timber Ridge Road. I think I found something related to that missing girl, Emma Hartley. Marcus sat up straighter. His instinct was to dismiss this. They'd gotten hundreds of tips. People saw that little blonde girl everywhere. Every grocery store, every gas station. Mass hysteria masquerading as helpful citizenship. But something about the voice stopped him. The way it said, I think. Not like someone looking for attention. Like someone who wished he was wrong. Where are you? Right now, Mr. Wade? Still at the location? No. I'm back at my trailer. But I can show you where it is. It's about 2 miles into the Whitmore Forest, off the old logging road. Marcus felt a headache building behind his eyes. Whitmore Forest. They'd searched the accessible areas. Had dogs out there for 12 hours on day 2. But 2 miles in? That was past where the search teams had gone. That was deep terrain, hard to access, easy to miss. Against his better judgment, against the voice of the county commissioner in his head, he said, Stay there. I'm coming to you. The trailer on Timber Ridge Road was worse than Marcus expected. The yard was mostly mud and weeds. A rusted truck with 2 flat tires slumped against a shed that looked like a strong wind would take it down. When Thomas Wade answered the door, Marcus had to work not to show his reaction. The man looked like he'd been hollowed out. Thin in a way that suggested meals were optional. Eyes that had seen things Marcus, even with 20 years in law enforcement, probably couldn't imagine. But those eyes were clear, focused. And when Thomas handed him a plastic bag containing the purple fabric, Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Inside the trailer, Marcus met Sargent. The dog watched him with an intensity that was almost human. 3 legs, Marcus noted, scarred up, like his owner. Thomas spread out a hand-drawn map on a table that was mostly covered in coffee cups and old newspapers. His hand shook as he pointed to a spot, marked with an X. Here, about 2 miles northeast of where your team stopped. There's a shelter, camouflaged. Someone's been living there. I found the jacket inside, but no girl. Marcus studied the map. The drawing was precise, detailed, with topographical features marked. Military training, he realized. This guy had been a soldier. Why didn't you call this in immediately? Marcus asked. Thomas looked at him. Because 3 years ago I called in a suspicious car outside a 7-Eleven and I was wrong, and I had a panic attack in the parking lot, and the cops had to restrain me, and I spent 72 hours in psychiatric hold. Because I'm the crazy veteran everyone crosses the street to avoid. Because I thought maybe you'd believe the evidence before you dismissed the messenger. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Shame, maybe. Or recognition. He'd dismissed plenty of witnesses over the years because they didn't fit the credible profile. How many Thomas Wades had he overlooked? All right, Marcus said. Show me. They took Marcus's SUV because Thomas's truck didn't run. Sargent sat in the back, alert, watching the trees. Thomas directed them off the main road onto a dirt track that barely qualified as a path. They had to park eventually and walk the last half-mile. Thomas moved through the forest like he was reading a language Marcus didn't speak. Every broken branch, every disturbed piece of ground. This is fresh, Thomas said, pointing to footprints in soft earth. Size: 11, maybe 12. Adult male. Made within the last day, judging by how the edges haven't collapsed. Marcus had to admit, the guy knew what he was talking about. When they reached the shelter, Marcus immediately called for backup. Then he photographed everything: the sleeping bag, the lantern, the water bottles, and the purple jacket with the hand-stitched daisy. It was Emma's. He knew that before they'd even run it. But Emma wasn't there. Whoever had taken her had moved her. The question was, where? And more urgently, when? Thomas was standing at the edge of the clearing, Sargent beside him. The dog was growling again, that same low, frightened growl. Thomas, Marcus called. Your dog hearing something? Thomas didn't answer for a moment. Then, not hearing, smelling. There's something else here. Thomas and Sargent moved toward a dense thicket of rhododendron. Marcus followed, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. Sargent stopped at what looked like solid vegetation, but when Thomas pulled the branches aside, Marcus saw it. A root cellar. Old, probably from when there'd been a homestead here generations ago. The wooden door was new, though. Someone had replaced it. Recently. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. Thomas stepped back. But Thomas was already moving forward. Marcus wanted to stop him, wanted to follow protocol, wanted to wait for backup. But something in Thomas Wade's eyes, something fierce and determined and maybe a little bit crazy, made Marcus hold back. Thomas pulled the cellar door open. The smell that came out was earth and darkness and fear. Marcus shone his flashlight down. There was a ladder, 12 feet down maybe, and at the bottom, huddled in the corner with her hands bound and her mouth taped, was Emma Hartley, alive, conscious, terrified, but alive. Marcus felt his knees almost give out. 73 hours. 1 hour past the deadline. 1 hour past when everyone had given up. Thomas Wade said something. So quiet, Marcus almost missed it. No one gets left behind. Then Sargent barked, urgent and loud, and Thomas spun around just as a man came crashing through the brush, wild-eyed and desperate and holding a hunting knife. The man who'd taken Emma. The man who'd just run out of time. Everything happened in the space between heartbeats. The man was moving fast, faster than Marcus expected. Mid-40s, bearded, wearing canvas work clothes. Not the monster of nightmares. Just a man, which somehow made it worse. Marcus was reaching for his weapon but knew he wouldn't clear leather in time. The man was too close, too fast, and the knife was already coming up. Thomas Wade stepped between them. No hesitation. Just muscle memory and something older than thought. The kind of reflex that gets trained into you in places where hesitation means death. Thomas caught the man's wrist mid-swing. The impact drove both of them backward into the dirt. Marcus heard something crack. Couldn't tell if it was bone or branches. Sargent was snarling now, circling, looking for an opening. The man was strong, younger than Thomas, healthy, not carrying 3 years of PTSD and shrapnel and nightmares. But Thomas had fought in worse conditions, had grappled with insurgents in alleyways where one mistake meant a video on the internet. His body remembered even if his mind didn't want to. The knife came loose, skittered across leaves and roots. Marcus kicked it away, finally had his weapon drawn, was shouting commands that no one was listening to. Thomas had the man pinned now, forearm across his throat, knee in his spine. The man was gasping, spitting, screaming things that didn't make sense. She was mine. I found her. She was perfect. Marcus felt his stomach turn. He'd heard this before. Different words, same sickness, the entitlement, the possessiveness, the complete inability to see another human as anything but property. Thomas held him there until Marcus got the cuffs on. Then he rolled away, breathing hard, his chest heaving in a way that sounded painful. Sargent was immediately at his side, whining, licking his face. Thomas pushed himself up to sitting and Marcus saw his hands, both of them shaking violently now. The adrenaline crash, the body's betrayal after the fight. Thomas tried to hide them but couldn't. Marcus pretended not to notice. Backup would be here any minute. He could hear sirens in the distance. The cavalry arriving after the battle was won. Marcus hauled the man to his feet. Read him his rights from memory while the man stared at Thomas with something that looked like confusion, like he couldn't understand how someone so broken had beaten him. Marcus understood it, though, had seen it before in other contexts. The most dangerous fighters aren't the ones with nothing to lose. They're the ones with one thing to protect, one thing that matters more than their own safety. For Thomas Wade, that thing had been a 9-year-old girl he'd never met. A purple jacket with a daisy patch. The idea that someone could still be saved. Emma was crying when they brought her up from the root cellar. Not hysterical crying. The quiet kind that children do when they've run out of the energy for anything else. Marcus wrapped her in his jacket and carried her himself. Wouldn't let anyone else touch her until her mother arrived. Thomas stayed back, standing at the edge of the clearing with Sargent. Marcus noticed him swaying slightly. Noticed the way he kept his hand pressed to his chest. "Are you hurt?" Marcus called. Thomas shook his head, but Marcus wasn't convinced. The paramedics would check him out whether he wanted them to or not. Jennifer Hartley arrived 17 minutes later. The ambulance had beaten her there, and the EMTs were checking Emma for injuries. Dehydrated, bruised, terrified, but alive, whole. Marcus watched Jennifer fall to her knees beside the stretcher, watched her daughter reach for her, watched them hold each other with the kind of grip that would leave marks. And he felt something he hadn't felt in the 72 hours of searching, something like redemption, like maybe the universe wasn't entirely random and cruel, like maybe sometimes the broken pieces came together the right way. The media showed up before they could transport Emma to the hospital. Of course they did. Someone with a scanner and no ethics. Marcus tried to shield the girl, but the cameras caught everything, including Thomas Wade, standing off to the side, trying to disappear into the trees. One reporter recognized something newsworthy, shouted a question. Sir, were you the one who found her?" Thomas looked like a deer in headlights. Marcus saw him calculating escape routes, saw the panic starting to build. Before he could intervene, Jennifer Hartley stood up. She left her daughter with the paramedics and walked straight to Thomas. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, this man who looked like he'd been through his own personal hell. This man who'd saved her daughter when everyone else had given up. Then she did something that made every camera in the clearing focus on them. She hugged him, just wrapped her arms around this stranger and held on. Thomas stood there rigid, uncertain, his arms at his sides. Marcus could see him trembling, could see the effort it took not to break. Then, slowly, Thomas's arms came up, and he hugged her back. And Sargent sat at their feet, patient as stone, waiting for his person to remember how to breathe. The man who'd taken Emma was named Dale Jennings, unemployed factory worker, lived alone, had a record of minor offenses, nothing violent, nothing that would have flagged him. He'd seen Emma playing in her yard, and something had broken in whatever passed for his conscience. He'd planned it for 3 days, watched her routine, waited for the moment when her mother was inside. Took her so quickly and quietly that no one saw. 30 seconds, and a little girl was gone. Dale Jennings was sitting in Marcus's patrol car now, staring at nothing, still muttering about finders keepers. As they loaded Emma into the ambulance, Jennifer turned back to Thomas. "What's your name?" "Thomas Wade," he managed. "Ma'am." She took his hand. Both of them, despite the shaking. "Thomas Wade. I will remember that name every day for the rest of my life." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to hold that kind of gratitude. So he just nodded. Jennifer climbed into the ambulance with her daughter. And as it pulled away, lights flashing, Thomas finally let himself collapse against a tree. Sargent pressed against him, solid and warm. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Wade let himself cry. Not from pain, from relief. From the realization that maybe he wasn't entirely broken. Maybe there was still something inside him that worked. That mattered. That could save instead of just surviving. Marcus approached slowly, gave him a moment, then said, "You did good today, Wade. Real good." Thomas wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Just followed my dog, Sheriff." Marcus smiled. "Best kind of police work." Then, more seriously, "We're going to need a statement, and the media's going to want to talk to you." Thomas's face went pale. Marcus raised a hand. "I can handle them. But there's going to be attention. You should know that." Thomas nodded. Didn't look happy about it. But he nodded. They walked back to the SUV in silence, Sargent limping alongside. And behind them, the forest settled back into quiet. The secret place that had almost kept Emma Hartley forever. The place that had instead revealed Thomas Wade was more than his scars. The first 3 days after they found Emma, Thomas Wade's phone rang 47 times. He didn't answer once. Reporters had tracked down his number somehow. Producers from morning shows. A podcast about unsolved cases wanting to do an episode on solved ones. Even a literary agent asking if he wanted to write a book. Thomas let every call go to voicemail. Listened to exactly none of them. He'd given his statement to Sheriff Donnelly. That should have been enough. But America loved a story, especially the kind with a broken hero who proves he's not so broken after all. The kind that made people feel good, that made them believe the world still had some justice left in it. Jennifer Hartley tried to visit on day 4. Thomas watched from the window as her car pulled up to the trailer. Saw her get out, holding a casserole dish. Saw her walk toward the door. He didn't answer when she knocked, just stood there frozen while Sargent whined softly. He wanted to open the door, wanted to tell her she was welcome, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His throat closed up. His hands went numb. The old panic. The kind that made him feel like he was drowning on dry land. She knocked 3 times, then left the casserole on the steps with a note. He read it hours later, after dark. "Mr. Wade. Thank you feels too small. Emma asks about you. About Sargent. She wants to thank you herself. Please, let us try." He couldn't do it. Couldn't face that little girl. Couldn't look into eyes that had seen the inside of a root cellar for 73 hours and pretend he was someone worth thanking. Because the truth was, he'd just followed his dog. The truth was, any decent human would have done the same. The truth was, he wasn't a hero. He was a man who'd killed people in a desert half a world away, who had friends' blood in the treads of his boots no matter how many times he scrubbed them, who woke up most nights choking on air that felt like sand. Heroes didn't have nightmares about the faces of the people they'd shot. Heroes didn't spend 72 hours wondering if maybe everyone would be better off if they just didn't wake up. Sheriff Donnelly came by on day 8. Thomas did answer for him. Mostly because Donnelly had helped him with the VA paperwork last year when Thomas was ready to give up on disability. Benefits entirely. The sheriff stood on the porch looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes. Saturday. Off duty. That made this personal, Thomas realized. Mind if I come in? Thomas stepped aside. The trailer was cleaner than it had been. He'd been scrubbing things, fixing things, keeping busy. Anything to keep his mind from replaying the moment that knife came at them, from wondering what would have happened if he'd been a half-second slower. Donnelly sat at the small table, accepted coffee, didn't comment on the fact that Thomas's hand shook when he poured it. "They're giving me a commendation," Donnelly said. "Recognition for solving the case. There's going to be a ceremony. County commissioner wants good press. Show that law enforcement works, even when it's hard." Thomas didn't say anything, sipped his coffee, waited. "The thing is," Donnelly continued, "it wasn't me who solved it. It was you. You and that three-legged dog. You're the one who should be getting recognized." Thomas finally spoke. "Don't want recognition, just wanted to help." Donnelly nodded like he'd expected that. "I know. But Wade, listen to me. What you did matters. Not just to Emma, not just to Jennifer, to everyone, to me. You showed up when everyone else quit. That means something." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "I didn't show up, Sheriff. I followed my dog into the woods because I had nothing better to do. I found a piece of fabric. That's not heroism. That's not even competence. That's just dumb luck." Donnelly leaned forward. "You could have walked away. Once you saw that shelter, you could have called me and stayed home. But you didn't. You came with me. You helped track. And when that son of a bitch came at us with a knife, you stepped between him and everyone else without thinking. That's not luck, Wade. That's character." Thomas didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know how to explain that what Donnelly saw as bravery felt to Thomas like reflex. Like his body doing what it had been trained to do before his mind could catch up and remind him of all the reasons why he shouldn't. He'd stepped in front of that knife the same way he'd stepped in front of his unit 100 times in Afghanistan. Not because he was brave, because he was already broken. What did it matter if he got more broken? But Sargent had pressed against his leg the moment Donnelly said character, and Thomas found himself absently scratching behind the dog's ears. Maybe Sargent had character. Maybe that counted for something. "Jennifer wants to organize something," Donnelly said after a moment. "A thank you. Community thing. Nothing big. Just people who want to show appreciation. I told her I'd ask you. But I'm guessing the answer's no." Thomas nodded. "Can't do crowds. Can't do attention. Can barely do this conversation, Sheriff." "No offense." "None taken," Donnelly said. He stood up, seemed to consider something, then said, "My dad was in Vietnam. Came back different, you know? Angry. Scared. Couldn't hold a job. Drank himself to death by 53. And everyone just wrote him off as a casualty, as someone who couldn't adjust. But the thing is, he tried. He tried so hard. And nobody gave him credit for that. For just getting up every day when everything in him said to quit." Thomas looked up at the sheriff. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you remind me of him," Donnelly said. "And I don't want you to end up like him. You did something impossible yesterday. You saved a life. Maybe it's time to let people thank you. Maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself for being human." He left his card on the table. Not his business card. His personal one. With his cell number. Call if you need anything. Anything at all. Then he was gone. And Thomas was alone with Sargent and the echo of words he didn't know how to hold. The nightmares got worse after that. More frequent. More intense. He'd dream he was back in that clearing, but now the knife connected. Now he was too slow. Now Emma stayed in that root cellar forever. Now Sargent had only 2 legs. 1 leg. No legs. Now everyone he'd ever failed came walking out of the forest. Ramirez, the others from his unit, the civilians in Kandahar, the woman in the blue headscarf he'd seen for exactly 3 seconds before the shooting started. They stood in a circle around him, not accusing, just watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. He woke up on day 12 in his truck. Didn't remember driving. He was parked outside Henderson Elementary School. 6:47 a.m. Kids were being dropped off, parents walking them to the door. And there, getting out of a silver sedan, was Jennifer Hartley and Emma. The girl looked smaller than he remembered, thinner. She was wearing a yellow backpack and holding her mother's hand with the grip of someone who might never let go. Thomas knew he should leave. Knew this looked wrong. A strange man in a truck outside an elementary school. But he couldn't seem to make his hands turn the key. Then Emma saw him. He watched her freeze, watched her say something to her mother, watched Jennifer turn and follow her daughter's gaze. For a moment, Thomas thought she'd call the police, thought she'd see him for what he was, a damaged man who didn't belong in the daylight world. But instead, Jennifer smiled, said something to Emma. And then they were walking toward his truck. He had approximately 10 seconds to decide whether to drive away or stay. He stayed, because running was starting to feel like the same thing as giving up, and he'd given up enough. Emma stood by his window. Up close, he could see she'd been crying recently. Her eyes were red. There were dark circles that shouldn't be on a 9-year-old's face, but she was trying to smile. "Hi, Mr. Wade." Her voice was small but steady. "Hi, Emma," he managed. His voice sounded like rust. "How are you doing?" She considered the question seriously. "Mom says I'm being brave, but sometimes at night I get scared. Is that okay?" Thomas felt something crack in his chest. "Yeah, that's okay. I get scared at night too." Emma nodded like that made sense. She looked at Sargent, who'd poked his head between the seats. "Can I pet your dog?" "Sure." She reached in through the window, and Sargent licked her hand. Emma laughed. It was the first time Thomas had heard her laugh. It sounded like hope. "He's nice," she said. "What's his name?" "Sargent." "Like a soldier?" "Yeah, like a soldier." Emma petted Sargent for another minute, then stepped back. Her mother's hand was on her shoulder now, protective but not pulling her away. "Mom says you're a hero," Emma said. Thomas shook his head. "I'm not." "You are," Emma insisted. "You found me. You and Sargent, and you stopped the bad man. That's what heroes do." Thomas didn't know how to argue with a 9-year-old who'd spent 3 days in a hole in the ground. Didn't know how to explain that heroes don't cry themselves to sleep, that heroes don't need 3 different medications just to function, that heroes don't look at their own reflections and see someone unrecognizable. So he just said, "I'm glad you're okay, Emma. I'm glad Sargent found you." She smiled, really smiled. "Me too." Then Jennifer was guiding her toward the school, but Emma turned back once. "See you later, Mr. Wade." And Thomas, despite everything, found himself saying, "See you later, Emma," meaning it, hoping it was true. 3 weeks after Emma Hartley was found, Thomas Wade received a letter. Not a bill. Not a government form. An actual letter, handwritten on blue paper addressed to him in careful cursive. He almost threw it away without opening it. But Sargent was watching him with those dark eyes, and Thomas had learned that sometimes the dog knew things before he did. So he opened it. Inside was a single page. "Dear Mr. Wade, you don't know me. My name is Richard Hartley. I'm Emma's grandfather. I died 6 years ago. At least that's what everyone thinks. But the truth is more complicated. And you deserve to know it." Thomas read the letter 3 times. Each time the words made less sense. Or maybe they made perfect sense and his brain just didn't want to accept them. The letter continued. "I know this sounds insane. Maybe it is. But I've been living in the Whitmore Forest for 6 years. In a cabin about 4 miles north of where you found Emma. I've been watching, keeping track, making sure my family was safe. Because 6 years ago I discovered something about Dale Jennings. Something no one else knew. And when I tried to go to the police, I realized I couldn't. Because the thing I'd discovered implicated someone they'd never suspect. Someone who'd make sure I disappeared before I could testify. The letter was signed with coordinates, nothing else. Just numbers that Thomas recognized as a location deep in the forest. Past where the logging roads ended. Past where anyone had reason to go. His hands were shaking again as he folded the paper. This had to be fake. A hoax. Someone playing a sick joke. But the handwriting was old, careful, the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. And the paper smelled like wood smoke and earth, like it had been kept somewhere dry but primitive for a long time, like it had been waiting for the right moment to be sent. Thomas didn't tell Sheriff Donnelly, didn't tell anyone, just packed a backpack with water, a first aid kit, his old compass, and the letter. Sergeant watched him with interest, tail wagging slowly. "You want to go for a walk, boy?" Sergeant's response was to limp to the door and wait. At 600 hours the next morning, they were heading into the Whitmore forest, following coordinates that led to either answers or madness. Thomas figured either way. It beat sitting in the trailer counting his pills. The hike took 4 hours. The terrain was brutal. Thomas had to stop twice when his chest seized up, the shrapnel reminding him it was still there, still waiting to shift the wrong way and stop his heart. But Sergeant was patient, would sit and wait, tongue lolling until Thomas could breathe again. They crossed 2 ridges and forded a stream that came up to Thomas's knees. The coordinates led them to a box canyon, hidden by rock formations and thick pine. And there, nestled against the cliff face, was a cabin. Not a shelter. An actual cabin. Old-growth logs, proper construction, smoke rising from a metal chimney pipe. Thomas approached cautiously. Military training said, "Announce yourself." Civilian fear said, "Run." He compromised. Called out from 50 feet away. "Richard Hartley, I got your letter." The door opened slowly, and a man stepped out, 70 years old maybe, lean and weathered, long gray hair tied back, beard down to his chest. He was wearing canvas pants and a flannel shirt that had been repaired dozens of times, but his eyes were sharp, alert, and when he saw Thomas, he smiled. "Mr. Wade, thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." They sat on a porch that looked out over the canyon. Richard made coffee on a propane camp stove. The cabin was 1 room, efficient. Everything had a purpose, nothing wasted. Bookshelves lined 1 wall, solar panel rigged outside. Radio equipment Thomas recognized from his time in service. This wasn't a hermit living off the grid on accident. This was someone who'd planned to disappear and stay disappeared. Richard handed him the coffee. "I know what you're thinking. Why not just come back? Why not tell someone I'm alive?" Thomas sipped the coffee. "Actually, I'm thinking you better start explaining before I decide you're the one who took Emma." Richard's face went hard. "I would die before I hurt that child. She's my granddaughter, my angel. Everything I've done has been to protect her, to protect all of them." Thomas set down his coffee. "Then talk." Richard took a breath. 6 years ago, I was a contractor, did residential remodeling. I was working on a house in Henderson. The owner was away. I had keys. I was replacing drywall in the basement when I found something hidden in the wall cavity. Documents, photographs, evidence of a trafficking operation, children, dozens of them over 15 years. Thomas felt his blood go cold. The owner of the house? Dale Jennings' brother, Carl Jennings. Thomas's mind raced. He didn't know that name. But Richard continued. Carl was smart, careful. He used Dale as a scout. Dale would identify vulnerable kids, watch them, report back. But Carl did the actual abductions, had a network, safe houses, buyers. The documents I found detailed everything. Dates, locations, transactions. I photographed all of it, took it to the police station, asked to speak with the sheriff. Thomas knew what was coming, could see it in Richard's eyes. The betrayal. The moment when someone you trust shows you why you shouldn't. They made me wait, Richard said. Put me in an interview room, said the sheriff would be with me shortly. But the man who walked in wasn't the sheriff. It was Deputy Chief Alan Crawford. He looked at what I had, read through the documents, and then he looked at me and said these exact words. "Richard, you need to understand something. This investigation would destroy this community. It would hurt people you care about, people who don't deserve to hurt." I realized then that Crawford was involved. Maybe not in the trafficking itself, but in protecting it, in keeping it quiet. Crawford gave me a choice, Richard continued. Disappear, fake my death, leave town, or have an accident. A real one. He'd already decided what would happen to the evidence. It would be lost, misfiled, accidentally destroyed. No one would ever see it, and anyone who tried to bring it to light would end up in a ditch. I thought about fighting, about going over his head. But Crawford made it clear he wasn't the only one, that the network went higher than I could imagine. So I ran, staged a drowning at Lake Henderson, left my truck and my clothes, made it look real. And I came here. Thomas was trying to process this, trying to separate paranoid delusion from possible truth. You lived here 6 years? Watching? Why not just leave the state? Richard looked at him. Because Carl and Dale were still operating, and my family was still in Henderson. Jennifer, Emma. I couldn't leave them unprotected. So I watched. I hiked into town every few weeks, kept tabs, made sure they were safe. And 3 weeks ago, I was in town when I saw Dale watching Emma. I knew what that meant. I tried to intervene, tried to scare him off. But I was too late. By the time I hiked back and got into town, she was already gone. Then why didn't you tell the police where to look? Thomas demanded. Why let her stay missing for 3 days? You must have known about the root cellar, the shelters. Richard's voice broke. I didn't know. Dale and Carl kept multiple locations. They moved constantly. I knew the general area but not the specific sites, and I couldn't go to the police without exposing myself, without Crawford finding out I was alive. So I did the only thing I could. I made sure someone else would find her. Someone the system couldn't ignore. I left the purple fabric where your dog would find it. I knew you hiked that area sometimes. I'd seen you and Sargent. I gambled that you'd follow the trail. Thomas stood up abruptly. His chair scraped against wood. You manipulated this? You used me? Richard stood too. I saved her. Through you, yes. But I saved her. And now Dale is in custody and Carl is going to get sloppy. He's going to make a mistake. Because he doesn't know I'm alive. Doesn't know someone has all his evidence. Thomas felt rage building. The kind he hadn't felt since Afghanistan. The kind that made his vision narrow and his hands curl into fists. You should have come forward. Should have trusted someone. Richard's laugh was bitter. Trust who? The system that protects men like Crawford? The system that gave up on Emma after 72 hours? Thomas wanted to hit him. Wanted to drag him back to town and let Donnelly sort this out. But a part of him, the part that had spent 3 years watching the VA lose his paperwork, and counselors cancel appointments, and doctors prescribe pills that didn't work, understood. The system didn't save people like them. It processed them, filed them, forgot them. Emma was alive because a broken veteran and a 3-legged dog had refused to quit. Not because the system worked. Despite it. What do you want from me? Thomas asked finally. Richard pulled out a waterproof case from inside the cabin. Opened it. Inside were the documents, the photographs, the evidence he'd been keeping safe for 6 years. I want you to give this to someone who will actually do something. Someone outside Henderson County. Someone Crawford can't touch. The FBI maybe. State police. Someone. Because Carl Jennings is still out there. And now that Dale's been caught, Carl's going to either run or start cleaning house. Either way, more people are in danger. Thomas looked at the case. At Richard. At the life this man had given up to protect a secret that should have destroyed everyone involved. Why me? Thomas asked. Why not do this yourself? Richard smiled sadly. Because I'm a dead man, Mr. Wade. I don't exist. I can't testify. Can't be a witness, but you? You're a hero. You saved Emma Hartley. The media loves you. People trust you. If you bring this evidence forward, they'll listen. They'll have to. Thomas wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away from this conspiracy, this paranoia, this weight that he hadn't asked for. But Sargent was sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those knowing eyes. And Thomas remembered Emma's voice. You're a hero. That's what heroes do. He took the case. I'm not promising anything, but I'll look at it. I'll decide if it's real. And if it is, I'll find someone who'll listen. Richard's shoulders sagged with relief. That's all I ask. Thomas turned to leave, then stopped. Does Jennifer know? That you're alive? Richard shook his head. Better she doesn't. Better everyone thinks I'm gone. It keeps them safe. Thomas didn't agree, but he understood. Sometimes love looked like leaving. Sometimes protection meant staying dead. He and Sargent hiked back in silence, the waterproof case heavy in his backpack. Heavy with secrets that men had killed to keep. That night, Thomas spread the documents across his trailer floor. Sargent lay nearby, watching. Thomas read for 6 hours straight, and with each page, each photograph, each detailed transaction log, he felt his stomach turn. It was real. All of it. Carl Jennings had been trafficking children for 15 years, at least 40 victims that the documents proved, probably more that weren't recorded. And the network went beyond Henderson County. Names Thomas recognized. A judge in the state capital, a businessman who owned half the commercial real estate in the region, and Deputy Chief Alan Crawford, listed as a consultant who made problems disappear. Thomas called Sheriff Donnelly at 0200 hours, woke him up, didn't apologize. I need to see you. Now. Not at the station, somewhere private. Donnelly was at the trailer 30 minutes later. Thomas handed him the first document, watched his face change as he read, watched him understand, watched him reach for his service weapon instinctively, even though the danger was words on paper. Where did you get this? Donnelly asked, his voice dangerous and quiet. Thomas told him everything. The letter. Richard Hartley. The cabin. The 6-year cover-up. Donnelly's face went through several emotions. Disbelief, anger, recognition, horror. Crawford, Donnelly said finally. He'd had suspicions, small things that never added up. Cases that went cold for no reason. Evidence that disappeared. Witnesses who suddenly refused to testify. But he'd never had proof, never had reason to believe it went this deep. We need to move carefully, Donnelly said. If Crawford knows we're onto him, he'll burn. Everything and everyone involved. We need FBI, we need people he can't intimidate. Thomas nodded. And we need to protect Richard. He's the only living witness who knows the full scope. Donnelly looked at him. Richard Hartley is dead, Wade. Officially, legally dead. Thomas met his eyes. Then maybe he needs to stay that way until this is over. They coordinated with the FBI field office in Charleston. Special Agent Maria Santos arrived within 18 hours with a team. She was 45, professional, and had a reputation for taking down trafficking rings. She spread Richard's evidence across a conference table in a hotel room 50 miles from Henderson and said 2 words. Holy hell. Then she looked at Thomas. This is actionable. This is enough for warrants, seizures, arrests. But I need you to testify. Need you to explain the chain of custody. How you got this. Thomas had expected that. Had already decided. He'd testify. Would face whatever came. Because Emma was safe, but 40 other kids weren't. And someone had to speak for them. The arrests happened at dawn on a Tuesday. Coordinated raids across 3 states. Carl Jennings was taken from his home in handcuffs, screaming about rights he'd denied dozens of children. Deputy Chief Crawford was arrested at the station. Agent Santos personally supervised that one. made sure every camera was rolling when they read him his rights, made sure everyone saw that no one was above the law, not even the people sworn to uphold it. The judge, the businessman, 7 others whose names were in the documents, all taken into custody within 2 hours. By noon, every news station in the region was running the story. By evening, it had gone national. Thomas Wade became a hero again. But this time it felt different. This time he'd chosen to step forward, had chosen to carry weight that wasn't his responsibility, had chosen to be the kind of person Sargent seemed to think he was. The media wanted interviews, book to deals, movie rights. Thomas refused all of it, gave one statement through Agent Santos, then disappeared back to his trailer, back to the quiet, back to Sargent and coffee and the slow work of remembering how to be human. Emma came to visit on a Saturday, with her mother and her grandmother who Thomas had never met. They brought Sargent a new bed, orthopedic, for his joints. Brought Thomas a casserole and something else, a photograph in a simple frame. It was Emma with Sargent, taken the day. They'd talked outside the school, both of them smiling. On the back in Emma's careful handwriting it said, "To Mr. Wade and Sargent, thank you for finding me. Love, Emma." Thomas put it on the one shelf in his trailer that wasn't covered in junk, where he could see it when he woke up. A reminder that some things could still be saved. Richard Hartley remained dead, officially, legally. But sometimes late at night, Thomas would find fresh firewood stacked by his shed. Or his truck would have air in the tires he didn't remember filling. Or Sargent would bark at the tree line and Thomas would see a shadow that might have been a man, might have been a ghost, might have been a grandfather watching over the family he'd given up everything to protect. Thomas never tried to confirm it. Some truths were better left unspoken. 6 months after the arrests, Thomas Wade received a letter from the VA. His disability rating had been increased. His benefits expanded. He'd been assigned a new counselor who specialized in combat trauma. And at the bottom of the official letter, someone had handwritten a note. "Your country hasn't forgotten you. Neither should you forget yourself." It was signed by someone in D.C., someone who'd seen his testimony, someone who understood that healing wasn't weakness, that asking for help wasn't surrender, that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier could do was admit they needed support. Thomas started going to counseling, once a week, then twice. It was hard. Harder than combat, harder than finding Emma, harder than facing down Dale Jennings with a knife. But Sargent went with him, curled at his feet during sessions, and that made it possible. The nightmares didn't stop. Probably never would. But they got quieter, less frequent. Some nights he even slept. Really slept. Without seeing Kandahar, without counting the dead. Just darkness and rest and the sound of Sargent snoring by the bed. Jennifer Hartley started a foundation. For missing children. For cases that went cold after 72 hours. For families the system had given up on. She asked Thomas to serve on the board. He refused at first, said he wasn't qualified, wasn't stable enough, wasn't the right kind of person. She listened to all his objections, then said, "You're exactly the right kind of person. You're someone who doesn't give up. That's the only qualification that matters." So Thomas agreed, showed up to meetings, contributed what he could, learned that saving one person could ripple outward in ways he'd never imagined. Dale Jennings died in prison, shanked by another inmate who had daughters. The news reported it as gang violence. Thomas knew better, knew that even in the darkest places some codes still held. Carl Jennings was awaiting trial. Crawford had cut a deal, testified against the others to save himself. Thomas felt conflicted about that. Justice and mercy were complicated, but Agent Santos assured him that Crawford would still serve 20 years minimum, that his career was destroyed, his reputation ruined, that sometimes the punishment was living with what you'd done. Thomas understood that better than most. Emma Hartley started 5th grade, made honor roll, joined the soccer team, still had nightmares, still saw a therapist twice a week. But she was healing, growing, becoming someone new, someone stronger for having survived. She visited Thomas once a month, always brought treats for Sargent, always asked how Thomas was doing, with a seriousness that reminded him she understood, that she knew about the hard work of getting better, that she recognized him as someone on the same path, just further along. Or maybe not. Maybe they were walking it together, two people who'd been broken and were slowly remembering their shape. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Emma, Thomas hiked back to the root cellar. Sargent came with him, moving easier now on the new prosthetic the vet had fitted. The shelter was gone. The root cellar filled in. The forest reclaiming what had been stolen from it. Thomas stood there for a long time, remembering, processing. Then he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He prayed. Not to God exactly. He'd lost that faith in Kandahar, but to something. The universe. Fate. Whatever force had put him and Sargent on that trail the same morning Emma needed finding. "Thank you," he said to the trees, the sky, the silence. "Thank you for giving me one more chance to matter." As they walked, back Sargent suddenly stopped, ears up, alert. Thomas tensed, old reflexes, but Sargent wasn't growling. He was wagging his tail, and there, standing in a shaft of sunlight between the pines, was a man. Gray-haired, bearded, watching them with the careful distance of someone who'd learned to be a ghost. Richard Hartley raised one hand, a wave, an acknowledgement. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest, going back to his cabin, his vigil, his chosen exile. Thomas wanted to call out, wanted to tell him he could come home now, that it was safe. But maybe Richard knew something Thomas didn't. Maybe some sacrifices didn't have expiration dates. Maybe some fathers stayed dead so their daughters could truly live. Thomas and Sargent made it back to the trailer as the sun was setting. The photograph of Emma and Sargent caught the last light. On the table was a letter from the foundation. They'd found 3 children that month, cases that had gone cold, families that had given up, hope. But the foundation kept looking, kept pushing, kept refusing to accept that 72 hours was enough time to decide a life wasn't worth saving. Thomas opened a beer, his first in 6 months, sipped it slowly. Sargent settled at his feet with a content sigh, and Thomas Wade, broken veteran, forgotten man, accidental hero, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but close, purpose, meaning. The sense that maybe, despite everything his life had, been leading him somewhere. To a purple jacket in a forest, to a 3-legged dog that wouldn't leave, to a little girl who needed someone too broken to give up. The phone rang. He almost didn't answer, but it was Sheriff Donnelly's number, so he did. "Wade," Donnelly's voice was urgent. "We got a new case, 6-year-old boy, missing since yesterday morning. Search teams are out, but the terrain is rough. I was wondering, would you and Sargent be willing to consult?" Thomas looked at Sargent. The dog was already standing, already moving toward the door, already knowing that their work wasn't done, that it might never be done, that every day was a choice between giving up and showing up, and every day they'd choose to show up. "Yeah," Thomas said. "Give me the coordinates. We're on our way." He grabbed his field jacket, checked his pack, filled a bottle with water. Sargent waited by the door, patient and ready. Before they left, Thomas looked one more time at the photograph, at Emma's smile, at Sargent's joy, at the evidence that sometimes broken things could still save the world. Then he turned off the lights and locked the door, and as he and Sargent headed into the night toward another forest, another search, another chance to prove that 72 hours was just a number and hope was a choice, Thomas Wade finally understood the truth. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd decided that giving up wasn't an option. And sometimes, in a world that had forgotten how to care, that was enough. That was everything. That was exactly what the missing needed. Someone too stubborn, too broken, too determined to know when to quit. Someone who'd follow a three-legged dog into the darkness and trust that somewhere ahead there was light. There was always light, you just had to refuse to stop looking for it. The end.